Hello there once again, friends and enemies, and welcome back to Weird Deck Techs. Today we're talking about Infernoids. Infernoids is an archetype that's comprised mostly of special summon monsters, and it deals a lot with discarding cards, tributing cards, and banishing cards. Ultimately, it doesn't seem like there's too much to be said about the archetype itself, so let's go ahead and take a look at it, and we'll see how we feel about it. Here we have my Infernoid deck. If you haven't been here before, here's how it works. I make a deck as close to 40 cards as possible, as pure archetype as possible. I then go over the card by card, we take a look at some gameplay, and then I talk about my feelings on the archetype and on the deck. So starting us off in the main deck, we've got 2 copies of Infernoid Ononku. Cannot be normal summoned set, must be special summoned from your hand or graveyard by banishing 3 Infernoid monsters from your hand or graveyard, while the total levels and ranks of all effect monsters you control are 8 or lower, and cannot be special summoned other ways. That's a mouthful, so I'm going to go ahead and cut that out of the rest of the cards, because most of the cards have the same or a very similar requirement. When this card is special summoned, you can destroy all other monsters on the field. Once per turn during either player's turn, when a spell, trap card, or effect is activated, you can tribute 1 monster, negate that activation, and if you do, banish that card. 3 copies of Devyati. When this card is special summoned, you can destroy all spell and traps on the field except void cards. Once per turn, when another monster's effect is activated, quick effect, you can tribute 1 monster, negate that activation, and if you do, banish it. I treat Devyati as the resident boss monster of the deck. 2 copies of Attendel. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can activate this effect. This card can make a second attack in a row. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can tribute 1 monster, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. I love banish shenanigans. 3 copies of Saitsamus. If this card attacks an opponent's monster, this effect can be activated at the end of the battle phase. Banish 1 card on the field. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can tribute 1 monster, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard, banish it. The reason I have this at 3 is if you are able to perfectly destroy an opponent's monster, which is kind of likely given the high attack stat for this monster, as long as you can keep this monster alive, you're banishing cards without targeting. There we go. 3 copies of Shiet, or Siet. When this card declares an attack, you can banish 1 monster from your opponent's extra deck, their choice. Once per turn during either player's turn, you contribute 1 monster, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. I love extra deck banish, I love it. 1 copy of Piatti. When this card inflicts battle damage to your opponent by attacking an opponent's monster, you can send 1 random card from your opponent's hand to the graveyard. Once per turn during either player's turn, you contribute 1 monster, then target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it. 2 copies of Petrulia. Once per turn, you can target 1 spell trap on the field, destroy it. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Once per turn, during either player's turn, tribute a monster, target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard, banish it. This is a quick effect. 2 copies of Harmodic. Once per turn, you can target 1 monster on the field, destroy it. This card cannot attack the turn you activate this effect. Once per turn, during either turn, tribute a monster, target a card in your opponent's graveyard, banish it. This is a quick effect. 3 copies of Decatron, the only card in this deck that can be normal summoned. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can send 1 Infernoid monster from your deck to the graveyard, except Infernoid Decatron, and if you do, increase this card's level by the level of the sent monster. And if you do that, this card's name becomes that monster's, and replace this effect with that monster's original effects. It's an Infernoid that can become any other Infernoid. Last for the monsters, we got 1 copy of Permise. Once per turn, you can target 1 set card on the field, shuffle it into the deck. That card cannot be activated in response to this effect's activation. Once per turn during your opponent's turn, you contribute a monster, target 1 card in your opponent's graveyard, banish it. This is a quick effect. Moving on to spells, we start off strong with Void Apocalypse, a continuous spell. You can discard 1 card, send 1 fiend monster from your deck to the graveyard. You can send this face-up card from your spell and trap zone to the graveyard, send Infernoid monsters with different names from your hand and or deck to the graveyard, up to the number of monsters your opponent controls that were special summoned from the extra deck. You can only use 1 Void Apocalypse effect per turn, and only once that turn. I have this card at 1 because I wanted to spec more into Void Vanishment, which can get you more spell and traps, although I would recommend playing this card a little more than just 1, maybe 2 or 3. 1 copy of Void Imagination, continuous spell. Infernoid monsters you control whose original levels are 2 or higher become level 1, and all battle damage they inflict to your opponent is halved. You can send this card to the graveyard, fusion summon 1 Infernoid fusion monster from your extra deck, using monsters from your hand or your side of the field as fusion materials. If your opponent controls a monster that was special summoned from the extra deck and you do not, you can also use up to 6 monsters in your deck as fusion materials. You can use any other fusion spell you want in this deck. I really enjoy Void Imagination, although we aren't really going to be focusing on our fusion monster that much, at least the way that I understand this deck, so I only kept it at 1 because it is searchable. 3 copies of Void Vanishment, a continuous spell. You can discard 1 card, add 1 Void spell trap from your deck to your hand, except Void Vanishment or Null and Void. Also, you cannot normal or special summon monsters for the rest of this turn, except Infernoid monsters. You can only use this effect of Void Vanishment once per turn. If an Infernoid monster you control battles an opponent's monster, after damage calculation, you can send this card to the graveyard, banish those monsters. 2 copies of Void Expanse, a field spell. During your standby phase, you can special summon 1 Infernoid token. To special summon an Infernoid monster using its own procedure, you can banish Infernoid monsters you control instead of those in the graveyard, or any combination of both. Your opponent cannot target Infernoid monsters you control for attacks or with card effects, except the Infernoid monster you control with the highest level, either if tied. This is the type of field spell that I look for in archetypes. Last for the spells, 2 copies of Void Seer, a quick play spell. Target 1 Infernoid monster you control, that target is unaffected by opponent's card effects this turn. If an Infernoid monster you control will be destroyed by a card effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard instead of destroying one of those monsters. Last for the main deck, we move on to traps, starting with Void Launch, a continuous trap card. During each of your standby phases, you can send up to 2 Infernoid monsters from your deck to the graveyard. If you control a monster that is not an Infernoid monster, send this card to the graveyard. Obviously, you're gonna wanna keep this deck pure if you're playing this card. 2 copies of Void Purification, a continuous spell. If you control a monster that is not an Infernoid monster, send this card to the graveyard. You can only use each of these effects of purification once per turn. During each of your opponent's standby phases, you can target 1 Infernoid monster in your graveyard, add it to your hand, or during each of your standby phases, you can target 1 of your banished Infernoid monsters and return it to the graveyard. 2 copies of Eye of the Void. Special summon 1 Infernoid monster from your hand, ignoring its summoning conditions, but its effects are negated until the end of the turn. Admittedly, Eye of the Void could probably go down to 1 to make room for Void Apocalypse, so that was just a little bit of an oversight on my part. Last for the main deck, 3 copies of Void Feast. Send 1 Void Spell Trap card from your hand or face up from your field to the graveyard to special summon up to 3 Infernoid monsters from your deck, whose total levels equal exactly 8, ignoring their summoning conditions. Moving on from there to the extra deck, we have 1 extra deck monster, 2 copies of Infernoid Tiara. It requires Infernoid Anunku, Infernoid Devialti, and 1 or more Infernoid monsters to be summoned. When this card is fusion summoned, you can apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of fusion materials with different names used for this card's summon. 3 or more materials, each player sends 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. 5 or more, each player sends the top 3 cards from their deck to the graveyard. 8 materials or more, each player returns up to 3 of their banished cards from the graveyard. And 10 or more, each player sends their entire hand to the graveyard. Overall, I feel like this card's a little bit weak. I guess it really just depends on how fast you're getting those cards out. Overall, though, I don't really see Tiara as a boss monster. It seems more kind of just like a utility monster that's there, you know? Of course, if you're going to use the first effect, you should probably have a 15 card extra deck just so you can match your opponent, you can get the maximum out of that effect there, and that could be super helpful. But there's the deck, so let's go ahead and take a look at how it plays, and then we'll be right back to talk about our opinions on it. Alright, so here we have our first hand, and admittedly, it's not the best of hands, but we can very easily set both of our Eye of the Voids here, and wait for our opponent's turn to summon any of the Infernoids in our hand if we would like. In which case, yes, our monster's effects would be negated until the end of the turn, but that's okay because for the most part, our monster's effects really only happen on our turn except for their banishing effect, which we can't do if we summon one of these. We can summon one right now if we'd like, just to keep a card on the field, just in case, but it seems very pertinent to keep these two cards face down. If we get Feather Dustered, we can activate both of them, and if we get, Lightning Stormed, we can also activate both of them. The one cool thing about Eye of the Void is that it is not a hard once per turn. Move to our end phase, have our opponent play out their turn. We're going to activate our Eye of the Voids to bring out our Shet and our Systemas, since they are the most attack heavy cards. This is a little bit of slow play. If we are lucky, they'll be staying on the field, but it seems very likely that they won't be staying on the field. Next turn we draw, and we get Void Apocalypse. We can use this, kind of, but it's not really going to help. Just to see if we would do better during a second game, let's go ahead and reset and draw again. This hand definitely looks a lot better. We've got Void Expansion, which we can go ahead and activate right now. That might help with some of our Infernoids later on, but even if it doesn't, we can go ahead and set Void Feast, and if we get in a real pinch during our opponent's turn, we can activate that to get some more Infernoids out. We can, of course, normal summon Decatron to go ahead and have it just become another Infernoid. And we can activate Void Vanishment just to have the option out there of having this card on the field. Admittedly, we can also use Void Vanishment to get Void Seer into our hand to make sure that we can keep Void Decatron on the field and unaffected by card effects. Overall, playing with this deck seems like it would be a bit of a 50-50 chance. You could probably do some stuff, but it also relies on you having the right cards in your deck and making sure your opponent's not going to wipe your field. Now that we've seen the gameplay, I can confidently say I'm not quite sure how to feel about this deck. Like I said during gameplay, it seems like a 50-50 chance of this deck doing much of anything. It definitely makes sense to me as to why more people don't play it. Of course, you can put Premature Burial in this deck, and that'll definitely help. Burial from a Different Dimension and Different Dimension Reincarnation definitely seem like two cards that would work pretty decent in this deck. As for the archetype, I'm not sure if there's anything that really needs fixing. It seems like a solid archetype. It just kind of seems like there's something there that's making it a little less consistent than it could be. This is probably something that Burial from a Different Dimension could help out with, but it really kind of depends on how many of those monsters you're getting into your hand. It seems like the way I've built the deck here, you would want less of the spell and traps that I've put in here, and more monsters so that you could constantly have those resources into your hand. Regardless of whether or not the monsters are useful to you on the field, they could be more useful to you getting other monsters out that would be more useful. So it seems to me that it's less of a problem with the archetype here and more of the problem with the way that I've built this deck, which is completely fine. Deck building isn't always going to be perfect. It's always more based on the way that you see an archetype, and after you kind of test it is how you determine, this is the way that I want to play, this is the way that would be best to play, All that being said, Infernoid seems okay. Not sure if I would play the deck, but I can definitely see why people might want to. But that is all for today. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know how you feel about Infernoids below, and if you've played them before, let me know how you like to play Infernoids. This deck seems interesting, and I'm sure there are people out there that probably find it interesting and want to know a little bit more about the tech. I know it's called Weird Deck Techs, but this series is mainly just about picking up weird archetypes that almost nobody plays and just showcasing them. Anyway, that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and until next time, drink your water.